Hi, my name's Hannah Fuller. I'll keep this short and sweet since some of the food is already starting to come out and it's really tantalizing. So I'm a senior in non-college, as you mentioned. It's been my pleasure to be a part of Mark Carey's class with my peers. Jordan did a great job. I'm going to go into some archaeological stuff just like she did. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to speak to you today, and the fact that this room is like sort of almost full is great, and I enjoyed that a lot. So Professor Carey's class really piqued my interest in relationships between climate change and indigenous culture change. I wanted to measure or examine to what extent culture change could be measured as a result of climate change. So essentially, how much does climate change determine culture change? So in order to answer this question, I thought that the best case would be to take a look from a historical standpoint in order to get some retrospective analysis on a period of climate change. I selected the Little Ice Age as this period because there were significant impacts on people and landscapes of both continental Europe and the North Atlantic, including Greenland, which is where my study is going to be focused. There has been a lot of very scientific focused research on the Little Ice Age, especially from paleoclimatic sources, which I'll get into in just a second. The Little Ice Age was a long period of consistently cooler temperatures than we saw in the period before. So the medieval warm period and the post-industrial period, which we consider to be after 1800. Although there are fluctuations within this Little Ice Age, it was pretty fair consensus that it's occurred between 1200 and 1800 AD. In terms of the indigenous people I want to study in this period, the best recorded are the Thule people of Greenland. It shows, this image shows both an eastern and western side of Greenland. A lot of the sources that I've examined are coming from the western side. So these people are best recorded and studied and relevant to the time period between the late medieval warm period and onset of the Little Ice Age, which in Greenland occurred a little bit earlier than in continental Europe, between 1150 and 1225 AD. These people immigrated from Canada and Alaska as kind of a slow, not within one lifetime, but like a slow migration before 900 AD, and our predecessors of the modern indigenous Greenlanders. So what can a researcher draw out of the relevant research and evidence? Given that the Little Ice Age is such a widespread and differentiated scenario, it has quite a few different effects. And so in terms of climatic cause and effect patterns, it's important to kind of avoid climate determinism. Excuse me. So I came across this quote, even the best paleoclimatic data are of little use in the explanation of culture change if specific fluctuations cannot be convincingly linked to specific effects on resources critical to a past human economy. So keeping that in mind, it's also important to note that, important to note that cultural resource change is necessary but not sufficient to climatic change. So in order to prove that there was climatic change or cultural change, you have to link both the resources and resources to a significant change. And what is significant? That is really up in the air. It really depends on who you ask. In terms of what I'm going to go with for this particular analysis is significant cultural change would encompass forced migration, an extinction, or significant population decline, a significant discontinuity in cultural evidence, or changes in resources resulting in a very drastic shift. Those are from various sources. So again, I'd like to point out that we've discussed the box a little bit. This is research based on the evidence of academic sources from the institutions that I'm working within, which is the Research University. As a retrospective analysis, it is based a lot on archaeological science. I did find several examples of oral traditions, but again, those were recorded several hundred years after the period I'm looking at, and also by a Norwegian linguist who then translated it from original language to Norwegian to English. So there's a lot of lenses involved in this sort of research. So yeah, with this in mind, there are two significant resources that I identified as changing over time due to the impacts of the Little Ice Age: sea ice and animal migration in relation to hunting and diet. While these may sound on the surface very much like economic variables, the reliance on resources goes a little bit deeper. These variables are not entirely separate either, as hunting and sea ice can be very intertwined in this case. So archaeological evidence is, a majority of these findings, archaeological evidence comprises most of the evidence because of lack of anecdotal knowledge, and as I mentioned before, the kind of the lack of clarity in oral tradition. And the only historical records from the period come from brief contact with European settlers, so that's not really something I'm going to be examining. So the evidence that does exist relating to animal resources is purely archaeological, coming from analyzing middens, settlements, and other archaeological sites for animal remnants, objects, tools, etc. These findings indicate that what the residents at the sites hunted and ate, so we'll be kind of extrapolating from that. In terms of environmental conditions, specifically sea ice, I already mentioned paleoclimatic sources. These definitely come from very scientific background, but paleoclimate, basically reconstruction is based on proxy evidence, so in this case ice cores from Greenland. Essentially these reconstructions can come from various natural sources, but as I said, I typed this sentence twice. Ice cores from Greenland are the most pertinent in this case. So in terms of cultural connection and use of sea ice, there is evidence of dog sled hunting, seal hunting, and ice fishing, and other cultural practices that indicate a certain reliance on the presence of sea ice. In cases of decreased sea ice, which happened seasonally within the late medieval warm period, there is evidence of also whale hunting in open waters. So there was a benefit of annual cycles and the changing of presence and frequency of ice. And as the onset, I'll get to that in a second. In terms of subsistence hunting, and a little bit of analysis of harpoon points, kind of like what Jordan was mentioning, spearheads. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Thule were hunting seals, whales, and walrus, actually, as well. There's evidence of small whaling boats called umiaks, and those are present within the stories in oral tradition as well. With a diverse diet of Arctic mammals, as I mentioned, seals, whales, walrus, as well as fish and birds from other smaller weapons and tools. The Thule had a significant amount of resilience to the fluctuations in weather and climate. I say they had that, it's predicted that that was the case. So the cultural connection to subsistence hunting was that hunting was more than just simply for food. Clothes, the boats that I mentioned were seal skin, and other functional items from daily life were made from these byproducts. So when I say subsistence, which we've already kind of discussed is not a good word to use, I mean more than just based on the necessity to eat, but also materials used in a cultural context. And then also the practices, as I mentioned, hunting, ice fishing, etc., are cultural practices. So how does all this relate to the changing climate of the Little Ice Age? With the onset of the Little Ice Age, there were significant shifts in resources. The presence and frequency, as I mentioned, of ice definitely changed. It's impossible to say what exactly happened, but it's probably indicated that it went up. There's near constant coverage at the latitudes we're talking about, and where there may have only been seasonal coverage and open water whaling, there was probably none. For marine species, the ice presence definitely would have caused a shift. Lacking open water, no whales would go to those latitudes. Continuous cold weather would discourage terrestrial and marine species from migrating far enough north. Species like walrus and seal probably had, the adaptive capacity to remain. and there was definitely decreased presence of other species. So these changes presumably resulted in a loss of diversity of diet, as particularly whaling surely decreased necessary staples in their diet. However, an analysis of archaeological sites doesn't really show any significant changes in the evidence that I have gotten to so far between the period of 900 to 1200, which is the late medieval period, to the early onset of the Little Ice Age. So what I expect to see in further analysis and reading, which I still do have to do, is that animal bones of Thule archaeological sites will show decreased diversity of subsistence animals. So to what extent did climate change affect culture change? In the cases of what I've found, the Little Ice Age changed conditions but did not necessarily necessitate drastic cultural change. Simply shifted reliance of certain species onto others. This reinforces the fact that changes in cultural resources are necessary but not sufficient to culture change. And I do expect to find evidence of decreased species of both whale and other subsistence species. And so, given that there was no evidence of drastic migration, no significant changes in the archaeological evidence, nothing that could really be called significant cultural change, I call it adaptation. Certainly there's adaptation, or at least shifting, but no clear discontinuity between the onset of the Little Ice Age and the late warm period and the onset of the Ice Age. So some concluding thoughts from my interpretation. Despite clear linkages between climate changes and changes in sea ice and subsistence species as cultural resources, the Thule culture showed resilience by adapting without significantly changing their culture, reinforcing the assertion that humans are not passively awaiting their climate